And now, another informative video from the NASA archives.
Had to develop all kinds of new materials that didn't burn in oxygen, which we did, and tested those, and then we had to fabricate everything went into the crew module out of that new material. And we were successful in doing that, and we also had to design and build a quick opening hatch, outward opening hatch, which we did. And we also went back and looked at other systems and got more redundancy in the vehicle. And that took about 21 months, and we were finally ready to fly the first manned flight again in October of 1968. And the crew that was on that flight, of course, was Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walt Cunningham. They had been the backup crew for Apollo 1. And so we were getting ready to fly that flight, and the individual I worked for, George Lowe, who was the Apollo spacecraft program manager, had taken a short vacation in August. He'd been working 7 days a week, almost 24 hours a day, ever since he took over as manager of the program. So he took a brief vacation, and he came back and told me that I don't think we're going to make it by the end of the decade if we stay on the present plan. So we need to change. And he said, I am going to propose that if we're successful on Apollo 7, we will take the next flight to the moon of the command module, Apollo 8, 2 months later. And he talked to Chris Kraft to see if that was a feasible plan, and Chris Kraft came back in about 2 days and said, yes, it was. And so they convinced NASA leadership, and so the plan was if Apollo 7 was successful, 2 months later we would go do Apollo 8. But we had another problem from that spring of that year. In April of 1968, we launched the second flight of Saturn V. And the Saturn V first flight was very successful, but the second flight was not so. We had major oscillations on the first stage, and we lost 2 engines on the second stage, and the third stage engine that we needed to use to insert on a lunar trajectory wouldn't restart as it's supposed to. And the spacecraft LEM adapter that surrounded the lunar module came apart. So at the same time we were getting ready to fly Apollo 7 and hopefully fly Apollo 8, we had to fix those problems, and the first flight, manned flight of a Saturn V was Apollo 8 in December of 1968. And that was shortly after that flight in April, which was not a good flight, but we were at the point where we were convinced that we had to fix those problems and were ready to fly the Saturn V again with men. And so on December 21st, we launched Apollo 8, and they went into a lunar orbiter on Christmas Eve in 1968. And that was the first time we really saw the moon close up, because they had taken a television camera. So as they orbited the moon for that first time, they showed the moon, and then they read from the Bible. And it was a very emotional Christmas Eve for everyone in the world that was watching it. And probably, maybe as you look back on it, at least I look back on it, Apollo 8 was probably more emotional for me than Apollo 11. It was the first flight that we sent humans out of Earth orbit. But that flight was very successful, and then 2 months later we launched another flight in Earth orbit to test the lunar module, because we'd only taken the command module and service module to the flight on the moon and on Apollo 7. So on Apollo 9, 2 months later, we took a lunar module for the first time on a Saturn V in Earth orbit. The crew separated in the lunar module, Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweikert, and then re-rendezvoused with the command module with Dave Scott. And that proved the lunar module, and we were convinced we could take it to the moon. And 2 months later, in May of 1969, we took Apollo 10 to the moon. And that turned out to be a very successful flight with the lunar module in lunar orbit. We did not land. We descended to a low altitude over the landing site we were going to use for Apollo 11, but didn't land, and took photographs. And we tested the ascent stage and the separation, and came back and re-rendezvoused in lunar orbit with John Young, who was flying the command module. Gene Cernan and Tom Stafford were in the lunar module. And that flight turned out to be successful, and so 2 months later, we went to the moon on Apollo 11, and the rest is really history. And we had achieved our goal of landing on the moon before the end of the decade. So we thought we could really go to a more relaxed schedule, so we didn't go back to the moon until 4 months later on Apollo 12. And on Apollo 12, we had been concerned about the mass concentrations on the moon and wanted to try to do a pinpoint landing. So on Apollo 12, we were going to launch and land next to a unmanned surveyor spacecraft that had landed on the moon. And we successfully achieved that. But we did have some excitement during the launch phase when we launched right after a cold front had gone through and lightning took out everything on the spacecraft during the launch. And we were able to recover that based on a young engineer in the Mission Control Center, John Aaron, who was able to figure out what had happened and tell the crew what switches to throw to get the power back. But after orbiting the Earth and convincing ourselves that we had a good spacecraft, we went ahead with the mission and sent Apollo 12 to the moon. And then, of course, Apollo 13, and Fred is going to tell you all about that. And then Apollo 14 a little later, and 15, 16, and 17. So Apollo turned out to be a great program, and at the time we stopped, we still had some additional Saturn V's and additional command modules. And for those of you in the ASC, you're going to see one of those Saturn V's that could have flown later this afternoon. So Apollo turned out to be a great program, and you're going to hear more about that from my colleagues here.
Thank you, George.